Hello!
And welcome to Larry's Library.
Hello, welcome to Larry's Library. Ignore Paul there with the wooden fake machete in front of his eyes.
I can still see you.
So, we're continuing to read Swiss Family Robinson. They're changing their abode. They have moved into a forest with a massive tree. And they've got to figure out how to get into the tree. So we start with chapter 10, Construction of a Ladder. Excuse you. Okay. Our repast ended, I observed to my wife that we should be obliged to pass the night on the ground. I desired her to begin preparing the harness for the animals, that they might go to the seashore and fetch pieces of wood or other articles which might be useful to us. I, in the meantime, set about suspending our hammocks to some of the arched roots of the trees. I next spread a piece of sailcloth large enough to cover them, to preserve us from the dew and from the insects. I then hastened with the two eldest boys to the seashore, to choose out such pieces of wood as were most proper for the steps of my ladder. Ernest was so lucky as to discover some bamboo canes in a sort of bog. I took them out, and with his assistance completely cleared them from the dirt, and stripping off their leaves, I found to my great joy that they were precisely what I wanted. I then instantly began to cut them with my hatchet in pieces of 4 or 5 feet long. The boys bound them together in faggots, and we prepared to return with them to our place of abode. That is a bundle of sticks, by the way. I next secured some of the straight and most slender of the stalks to make some arrows with, of which I knew I should stand in need. At some distance from the place where we stood, I perceived a sort of thicket, in which I hoped to find some young pliant twigs, which I thought might be useful to me. We proceeded to the spot, but apprehending it might be the retreat of some dangerous reptile or animal, we held our guns in readiness. Flora, who had accompanied us, went before. We had hardly reached the thicket before she made several jumps and threw herself furiously into the middle of the bushes, when a troop of large-sized flamingos sprang out, and with a loud rustling noise mounted into the air. Fritz fired when 2 of the birds fell among the bushes. One of them was quite dead, the other was only slightly wounded in the wing, and finding that he could not fly, he ran so fast towards the water that we were afraid he would escape us. Fritz, in the joy of his heart, plunged up to his knees in the water to pick the flamingo he had killed, and with great difficulty was able to get out again, while I, warned by his example, proceeded more cautiously in my pursuit of the wounded bird. Flora came to my assistance, and running on before, caught hold of the flamingo and held him fast till I reached the spot and took him into my protection. All this was effected with considerable trouble, for the bird made a stout resistance, flapping its wing with violence for some time, but at last I succeeded in securing him. You don't need to jump so much back there. Fritz was not long in extricating himself from the swamp. He now appeared holding the dead flamingo by the feet, but I had more trouble in the care of mine, as I had a great desire to preserve him alive. I had tied his feet and his wings with my handkerchief, notwithstanding which he still continued to flutter about to a distressing degree, and tried to make his escape. I held the flamingo under my left arm and my gun in my right hand. I made the best jumps I was able to get to the boys, but at the risk of sinking every moment in the mud, which was extremely deep, and from which it would have been difficult to release me. I now selected some of the oldest of the stalks of bamboo, and cut from them their hard-pointed ends to serve for the tips of my arrows. Lastly, I looked for 2 of the longest canes, which I cut for the purpose of measuring the height of our giant tree, about which I felt so deep an interest. When I told my sons the use I intended to make of the 2 longest canes, they indulged themselves in a hearty laugh at me, and maintained that, though I should lay 10 such canes up the trunk of the tree, the last would not reach even the lowest branch. I requested they would oblige me by having a little patience. We now thought of returning. Ernest took the charge of the canes, Fritz carried the dead flamingo, and I resumed the care of the living one. We at length arrived once more at our giant trees, and were received with 1,000 expressions of interest and kindness. All were delighted at the sight of our new captures. My wife, with her usual anxiety about the means for subsisting, asked where we should get food enough for all the animals we brought home. You should consider, said I, that some of them feed us instead of being fed, and the one we have now brought need not give you much uneasiness if, as I hope, he proves able to find food for himself." I now began to examine his wound, and found that only one wing was injured by the ball, but the other had also been slightly wounded by the dog laying hold of him. I applied some ointment to both, which seemed immediately to ease the pain. I next tied him by one of his legs, and with a long string, to a stake that I had driven into the ground quite near to the river, that he might go in and wash himself when he pleased. In the meantime, my little railers had tied the two longest canes together, and were endeavoring to measure the tree with them. But when they found that they reached no further than the top of the arch formed by the roots, they all burst into immoderate fits of laughter, assuring me that if I wished to measure the tree, I must think of some other means. I, however, sobered them a little by recalling to Fritz's memory some lessons in land surveying he had received in Europe, and that the measure of the highest mountains and their distance from each other may be ascertained by the application of triangles and supposed lines. I instantly proceeded to this kind of operation, fixing my canes in the ground and making use of some string which Fritz guided according to my directions. I found that the height of the lower branches of our tree was 40 feet, a particular I was obliged scrupulously to ascertain before I could determine the length of my ladder. I now set Fritz and Ernest to work to measure our stock of thick ropes, of which I wanted no less than 80 feet for the two sides of the ladder. The two youngest I employed in collecting all the small string we had used for measuring and carrying it to their mother. For my part, I sat down on the grass and began to make some arrows with a piece of the bamboo and the short, sharp points of the canes I had taken such pains to secure. As the arrows were hollow, I filled them with moist sand to give them a little weight, and lastly I tipped them with a bit of feather from the flamingo to make them fly straight. Just at this moment Fritz joined us, having finished measuring the ropes. He brought me the welcome tidings that our stock in all was about 500 fathoms, which I knew to be more than sufficient for my ladder. I now tied the end of the ball of strong thread to an arrow and fixed it to the bow. I shot it off in such a direction as to make the arrow pass over one of the largest branches of the tree and fall again to the ground. By this method I lodged my thread securely, while I had the command of the end and the ball below. It was now easy to tie a piece of rope to the end of the thread and to draw it upwards till the knot should reach the same branch. Having thus made quite sure of being able to raise my ladder, we all set to work with increased zeal and confidence. The first thing I did was to cut a length of about 100 feet from my parcel of ropes, an inch thick. Thus I divided into two equal parts, which I stretched along on the ground in two parallel lines, at the distance of a foot from each other. I then directed Fritz to cut portions of sugar cane, each 2 feet in length. Ernest handed them to me one after another, and as I received them, I inserted them into my cords at the distance of 12 inches respectively, fixing them with knots in the cord, while Jack, by my order, drove into each a long nail at the two extremities to hinder it from slipping out again. Thus, in a very short time, I had formed a ladder of 40 rounds in length, and, in point of execution, firm and compact, and which we all beheld with a sort of joyful astonishment. I now tied it with strong knots to the end of the rope which hung from the tree, and pulled it by the other till our ladder reached the branch, and seemed to rest so well upon it that the joyous exclamations of the boys and my wife resounded from all sides. All the boys wished to be the first to ascend upon it, but I decided that it should be Jack, he being the nimblest and of the lightest figure among them. Accordingly, I and his brothers held the ends of the rope and of the ladder with all our strength, while our young adventurer tripped up the rounds with perfect ease, and presently took his post upon the branch. But I observed that he had not strength enough to tie the rope firmly to the tree. Fritz now interfered, assuring me that he could ascend as safely as his brother, but as he was much heavier, I was not altogether without apprehension. I fastened the end of the ladder with forked stakes to the ground, and then gave him instructions how to step in such a way as to divide his weight by occupying 4 rounds of the ladder at the same time with his feet and hands. It was not long before we saw him, side by side with Jack, 40 feet above our heads, and both saluting us with cries of exultation. Fritz set to work to fasten the ladder by passing the rope round and round the branch, and this he performed with so much skill and intelligence that I felt sufficient reliance to determine me to ascend myself and well conclude the business he had begun. But first I tied a large pulley to the end of the rope and carried it with me. When I was at the top, I fastened the pulley to a branch which was within my reach, that by this means I might be able the next day to draw up the planks and timbers I might want for building my aerial castle. I executed all this by the light of the moon and felt the satisfaction of having done a good day's work. I now gently descended my rope ladder and joined my wife and children. My wife presented me with the day's work she had performed. It was some traces and a breast leather each for the cow and the ass. I promised her, as a reward for her zeal and exertion, that we should all be completely settled in the tree the following day, and we then assembled to supper. And that's the end of chapter 10, but it was pretty short. We're going to continue with chapter 11, the settling in the giant tree. The next morning we took our breakfast and fell to work. My wife, having finished her daily occupation of milking the cow and preparing the breakfast, set off with Ernest, Jack, and Francis, attended by the ass, to the seashore. They had no doubt of finding some more pieces of wood, and they thought it would be prudent to replenish our exhausted store. In her absence, I ascended the tree with Fritz and made the necessary preparation for my undertaking, for which I found it in every respect convenient. For the branches grew close to each other and in an exactly horizontal direction. Such as grew in a manner to obstruct my design, I cut off either with a saw or hatchet, leaving none but what presented me with a sort of foundation for my work. I left those which spread themselves evenly upon the trunk, and had the largest circuit as a support for my floor. Above these, at the height of 46 feet, I found others upon which to suspend our hammocks, and higher still there was a further series of branches destined to receive the roof of my tent, which for the present was to be formed of nothing more than a large surface of sailcloth. The progress of these preparations was considerably slow. It was necessary to raise certain beams to this height of 40 feet that were too heavy for my wife and her little assistants to lift from the ground. I had, however, the resource of my pulley, which served to excellent purpose, and Fritz and I contrived to draw them up to the elevation of the tent one by one. When I had already placed 2 beams upon the branches, I hastened to fix my planks upon them, and I made my floor double, that it might have sufficient solidity if the beams should be warped from their places. I then formed a wall of staves of wood like a park paling all round for safety. This operation and a third journey to the seashore to collect the timber necessary filled our morning so completely that not one of us had thought about dinner. For this once we contented ourselves with a bit of ham and some milk, which we ate, and returned to finish our aerial palace, which began to make an imposing appearance. We unhooked our hammocks from the projecting roots, and by means of my pulley contrived to hoist them up the tree. The sailcloth roof was supported by the thick branches above, and as it was of great compass and hung down on every side, the idea occurred to me of nailing it to the paling on 2 sides, thus getting not only a roof, but 2 walls also, the immense trunk of the tree forming a 3rd side, while in the 4th was the entrance to our apartment, and in this I left a large aperture, both as a means of seeing what passed without, and admitting a current of air to cool us in this burning temperature. The hammocks were soon hung on the branches, and everything was ready for our reception that very evening. Well satisfied with the execution of my plan, I descended with Fritz, who had assisted me throughout the whole, and as the day was not far advanced, and I observed we had still some planks remaining, we set about contriving a large table to be placed between the roots of the tree and surrounded with benches, and this place, we said, should be called our dining parlor. Exhausted by the fatigues of the day, I threw myself on a bank, and my wife having seated herself near me, I thanked her for the tender care she was ever imposing on herself, and then I observed to her that the many blessings we enjoyed led the thoughts naturally to the beneficent giver of them all, and tomorrow being a Sabbath day, we would rest from work in obedience to his command, and otherwise keep it holy. We now assembled round our table to supper, my wife holding in her hand an earthen pot which we had before observed upon the fire, and the contents of which we were all curious to be informed of. She took off the cover, and with a fork drew out of it the flamingo which Fritz had killed. She informed us that she had preferred dressing it with this way to roasting, because Ernest had assured her that it was an old bird which would prove hard and tough, and advised her to improve it by stewing. We rallied our glutton boy on this foible of his character, but his brothers gave him the name of the cook. We, however, had soon reason to know that he had conferred upon us an important obligation, for the bird, which roasted we perhaps should not have been able to touch, now appeared excellent and was eaten up to the very bones. The boys, now by my direction, lighted one of the heaps of wood, I tied long ropes loosely round the necks of our dogs, purposing to mount to our tent with the ends in my hand, that I might be able to let them loose upon the enemy at the first barking I should hear. Every one was eager to retire to rest, and the signal for ascending the ladder was given. The 3 eldest boys were up in an instant. Then came their mother's turn, who proceeded slowly and cautiously, and arrived in perfect safety. My own ascension was last and at the most difficult, for I carried little Francis on my back, and the end of the ladder had been loosened at the bottom, that I might be able to draw it up in the tent during the night. Every step, therefore, was made with the greatest difficulty, in consequence of its swinging motion. At last, however, I got to the top and drew the ladder after me. It appeared to them that we were in one of the strong castles of the ancient cavaliers, in which, when the drawbridge is raised, the inhabitants are secured from every attack of the enemy. Notwithstanding this apparent safety, I kept our guns in readiness for whatever event might require their use. We now abandoned ourselves to repose. Our hearts experienced a full tranquillity, and the fatigue we had all undergone induced so sound a sleep that daylight shone full in the front of our habitation before our eyes had opened. And that's the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12, which we'll hear on Tuesday. So we'll take the next 2 days off, Sunday, Monday. But the chapter 12, the Sabbath and the parable. And there's a nice picture of the tree and house. And I'll probably post that on Facebook tomorrow.
A tree house.
Or on Tuesday. Yes, it's a tree house. This has been Larry's Library.
Tree house.
Yeah.
And yes, I am wearing a tank top.
Bye.